treasuries in this period. And this graph here shows the spread between buyers and sellers. So usually this spread is absolutely tiny. So for the US, which is on the left axis, the spread in normal times is around 0.2 basis points, which means that buyers and sellers if you're buying a bond for 5 percentage points, you might sell that same bond for 5.002 percentage points. So a very small difference between buyers and sellers. A very liquid market where the price is very efficiently determined. And what we saw during March is that spread widened out. And that's because the market was beginning to break down, because people were forced to work from home and some people were unwilling to even trust treasuries. They wanted cold, hard physical cash. That's peaked around the end of March, beginning of April, until the worst of the panic sort of subsided and the Federal Reserve turned on the money taps. So in the end, we didn't see a financial crisis, despite the fact there were sort of initial warning lights. And you can see the size of the Federal Reserve response here by looking at their balance sheet. So this shows how many assets they held in their balance sheet in normal times, sort of slowly going with the real economy. Then we have the global financial crisis, and in blue, you can see these waves of quantitative easing, and both in terms of mortgage-backed securities and US bonds. So QE1, QE2, QE3, and they were slowly letting QE evaporate off the balance sheet. That was their long-term plan, to slowly let these assets sell off or expire. And then the COVID-19 panic comes along, and in the space of about 1 month, they expand the size of the balance sheet by roughly double. So they do basically 5 years worth of QE in the space of 5 weeks. And that continues to balloon out through 2020 and 2021. So really big financial cannons saying, if anybody wants to sell and wants cold hard cash in return, we will buy it off you and we will give you money instead. And that strong support was one of the big reasons why we saw the financial crisis that could have sparked if there had been an absence of the support not actually happen. And as I'm sure you're all familiar, we saw lots of different waves of COVID-19 occur, starting in China, but then spreading to other countries. So you can see Australia in the blue line, so we kind of peaked already and then went back to zero. And of course, unfortunately for the Victorians, or people who were living in Victoria at the time, we had more waves in Australia that pushed us back into lockdowns. And then we saw another explosion in 2021. So we saw a big cyclical wave. It was worse in winter than it was in summer, and it was somewhat ameliorated when we implemented things like mask mandates and better ventilation of indoor spaces. And it stayed for Australia and China at roughly COVID zero until we opened borders at the end of 2021, which if I slightly speed up this slide, we can get to in a slightly more efficient way. Whoa. And there, at the end of 22, you can see we finally had our big COVID waves once we had vaccinated the population and fully opened borders. All right, so how do we think about the pandemic in terms of formal modelling? And we're going to talk about this in 2 ways. First, how do we actually model the pandemic itself as sort of budding epidemiologists? Obviously, this is not a focus of the course. We're more thinking about the economic side of things, but it's important to get a grasp of the basic logics of modelling pandemics. And then we're going to talk about how we use different economic models during the pandemic to the sort of standard IS aggregate demand curve that we looked at during the global financial crisis. So the primary model used by epidemiologists is known as SIR models, which stands for susceptible, infectious, and recovered. And these have a few key features. The first is their dynamic models. They're all about how these share of the population evolve over time. The second is they are they show how the disease spreads in a given population. And the third is they're exponential in nature. So very small changes can lead to big changes in the final result. And the reason why they're called SIR models, susceptible, infectious, recovered, and the rate at which you transition from each period is usually a function of the size of the population at any given time. So the rate of infection depends on not only how many people you have susceptible, but how many people you have that are infectious. And you multiply those two population groups together to get the rate of new infections. What does this look like in practice? Well, it means you get these very non-linear results from epidemiological models, which are in some sense quite different to what we have seen in standard linear models. So here's a quick simulation of the sort of very basic SIR model, whereby you start off with one person who's infected at the beginning of 2020, and then that explodes over time until a large share of the population has been exposed, infected, and recovered from a disease. And these sorts of models usually, although not always, involves a concept known as herd immunity. What is herd immunity? Well, an underlying assumption of this model is that once you're infected once with COVID-19, you can't catch it again. Now, this is obviously not true of COVID in general, but it is true of a lot of diseases. So it's true of, say for example, hand, foot and mouth, you only catch that once. Chickenpox, you only catch that once. And in any model where that's true, you're going to have a share of the population who gets infected and recovered with the disease. And once that share of population that has acquired immunity to the disease reaches a certain threshold, known as herd immunity, then you're going to get a decreasing rate of growth of that disease as it struggles to find more susceptible people to continue to infect. And so what that means is once you hit the herd immunity threshold, the disease will start to naturally die off, if indeed you're fully immune to repeat infections. So you won't see the disease disappear overnight, but you see the growth rate start to de-accelerate. And so you get this overshooting effect where you get some additional people infected, but you don't get everybody infected. So at some level, you'll get some people who are lucky enough not to be ever exposed to the disease, and they won't have to go through a round of infection. So how does this interact with our health system? Well, you can add more complications into this model in order to see how we should respond to this pandemic with public health interventions. So what happens if we add the assumption of limited public ICU capacity into the model? So we know that a large share of the population is going to be infected, but we don't want them infected all at once, because if they do that, it will overwhelm our hospitals, overwhelm our ICUs, and lead us to have poorer health outcomes as a result. So one alternative, just letting the disease spiral out in an uncontrolled manner until we reach herd immunity, is to implement some measures such as increased hygiene protocols and physical distancing to reduce the speed at which the virus spreads. And if you do that, you can effectively create little booms and busts in the disease, whereby you have increased levels of protection when ICU capacity starts to be constrained, which send the disease into a decreasing rate of growth, or an R less than 1. And then when you lift those restrictions, it starts to grow again. So you can see how, at least initially, and this was one of the arguments made in March 2020, the idea was never to eliminate the virus or live in lockdowns forever, but we wanted to bend the curve, limit the rate of growth such that we didn't have our health systems overrun in one fell swoop. And we can even in this model have lockdowns. Not this simulation, but if you want, you can go to this website ncase.me/COVID-19, where you can do a whole range of different simulations with these SIR models. So you can say, well, what happens if immunity wears off? What happens if you have seasonal effects? What if you use contact tracing and isolation? What if different people spread the virus by different amounts? These are all different aspects of the disease that can be incorporated in a SIR model, and they all tweak slightly, give you slightly different answers in response to how the disease evolves. Okay, any questions about the basics of SIR models? Not the main focus of the course, but important to know how they work, because that's going to affect how we think about the economics of our main policy responses. Okay, so when we think about economic policy, obviously the decision about specific health policies is a question for health experts, but the decision about when to go into lockdowns or not is one which economists do have some input into. And so this was one of the questions that policymakers faced at the time, was how much should we lock down? How much should we restrict travel? And how should we compensate households and businesses if we do go into lockdown? And particularly that third question was a question of hot debate among economists at the time. So let's start with each question in turn. So the first question is, when and under what conditions do you want to institute a lockdown in an economy? So you want to know when to start a lockdown, where to lock down, how hard you want your restrictions to be, and then when to end the lockdown. And the answers to all these questions depend almost to a high degree on how you expect the pandemic to end. So you want to think about the endpoint of the virus before when you're formulating your initial strategy. And so there are sort of four possible end games when you think about these sorts of pandemics. The first is we develop some vaccine that's highly effective and that solves the pandemic. The second is we manage to eradicate the virus without a vaccine, but in doing so the population remains susceptible to further infection. The third option is we go for herd immunity, where we don't get a vaccine, but everyone eventually, or a large share of the population, eventually contracts the disease and develops herd immunity as a response. And the fourth is it exists as a chronic disease, where we never get a perfect vaccine that stops infection at a high enough rate, or alternatively the virus keeps on mutating and bouncing around the economy. And to be honest, we've at some point considered all four of these responses when it comes to COVID-19. We've obviously we developed a vaccine that was relatively effective, and for a while we thought it was going to be the final outcome, but it's obviously proved to be not perfectly effective, especially in the long run. For a while, at least here in Australia, we did eradicate COVID-19, but that proved to be not nearly as sustainable as we hoped it would be. Herd immunity was also a strategy particularly pursued by other countries around the world prior to the vaccine being developed. And then finally, the sort of final outcome for the pandemic, for COVID-19 at least, is that it's turned into a chronic disease, which means it's going to be infecting people around the world probably for the indefinite future. Okay, so let's assume we're not talking about COVID-19, we don't know it's going to end up as a chronic disease. If we consider each of these outcomes in turn, when does it make sense to lock down? And if you think the end game is going to end in a vaccination, then that's when the potential benefits of a lockdown are at their highest. Because what does a lockdown effectively do? Well, it has some fairly large economic cost. We obviously stop large amounts of economic activity in the economy. But what we achieve is the delay of people being infected, right? We stop people being infected who otherwise would be. So the benefit of lockdown is a number of prevented cases. And the question is, do these people who are not being infected because they're unable to leave their house, do they go on to be infected in the future, in which case you're merely delaying their infection, or do they instead get a vaccine that's developed in the future and thus never get infected at all? So the vast majority of people who are in Australia at the time probably fall into that latter category, where we got the vaccine before we ever got infected, and that's when the benefits are at their absolute highest. So when a lockdown's a good idea under this scenario, they're a good idea when you think there's going to be a vaccine and one that's relatively early in nature. So consider two scenarios here where we are modelling the same lockdown starting in 2020 and going for say 6 months. And we've got two scenarios with the vaccine. One where we develop a vaccine relatively efficient and early towards the end of 2021, which is sort of close to reality. And one where we develop a vaccine much later in the piece. So if we have a lockdown and an early vaccine, the benefits are relatively high. We stop the spread of the disease, relatively few people get infected, and then we roll out this vaccine relatively early and everyone gets the vaccine instead. And that means we've delayed people being infected, and then instead of them being infected in the future, they get vaccinated, and once they're vaccinated in this hypothetical world, they don't contract COVID-19 ever again. So that's an example where the large costs provide large benefits. What happens if you think the vaccine is further away? So here it's sort of a year later, but in principle it could be 3, 4, 5 years later. There was obviously a large amount of uncertainty about how quickly these vaccines would be developed. Well, in that case, the benefits of a lockdown are much lower, because if you lock down for 6 months and then open back up, you may have delayed the spread of the disease, but because the vaccine's a long time away, you're still going to have another wave, everyone's going to get infected, and so the actual benefits are pretty marginal. The benefits in this scenario are largely limited to the fact that your ICUs and hospitals will be less overrun to a small degree than under no lockdown scenario. So when does a lockdown make sense? They make sense when you're just about to develop a vaccine, which means that every single infection you prevent will be soon replaced with a vaccine, and so they can be safely exposed, or at least relatively safely exposed, to COVID-19 after that. When they don't make sense is when you're 10 years away from developing a vaccine. In that scenario, you're going to lock down for maybe, unless you lock down for the full 10 years, obviously not sustainable, then locking down early is only really delaying the inevitable, which is widespread infection. So when does a lockdown make sense? When you're imminently close to a vaccine. There are two obvious caveats to this sort of optimal lockdown strategy. The first is you need to have a rollout strategy. You don't just need vaccines, you need vaccinations, which means you need a way of getting all those vaccines into the population. That's not always a given, or at least not always possible. And the second qualification is that vaccine efficiency is never quite as simple as sort of 100% as we've modelled in these models. It's always going to have some degree of inefficiency. So how well do vaccines prevent infection, hospitalisation or death? Never 100%, and how high that number is going to vary how beneficial they are. Yep.
That model that you just had on the previous slide, so in its purest form, is the idea that you would be in lockdown up until the very moment that the population is vaccinated?
Yeah. In this world where you have, oh sorry, do you want to finish? No, in this world where the vaccine is instantaneously rolled out and is 100% effective, some big assumptions, you would lock down until that moment, vaccinate everyone, and then you've got a perfectly immune society. If you were in a position where that was going to take a long time, I mean, it might still be optimal to lock down, but the costs will be much higher. Why? Because you've got to stay in lockdown for a longer period of time. So it's sort of a question, right? As we'll discuss in a few slides' time, locking down for a week is actually not that costly. We sort of go into a lockdown every summer holidays, whereby we all just, stop going to work and sit on the beach for 3 months. Well, 3 months if you're in a particularly cushy job, maybe 1 month for most people. That cost of a lockdown, if it was like 10 years long, would be prohibitively high. Okay, so that's the end game result if you think there's going to be a vaccination that's highly effective. Then it can make sense to lock down, but only if you think you're going to develop the vaccine in a relatively timely manner.
Is this based off the vaccine working like 90%?
Yeah.
Like the standard sort of?
Yeah, that's right. So it's based on it being highly effective. If it's not highly effective, then obviously it's not going to be a very viable outcome. Yep.
Now it's mostly hypothetical in this
Yeah, it's a good question. The answer is it all depends. Like a lot of it depends on the qualities of the virus. A lot of it will depend on just the nature of the economy. Like we'd be much better at a lockdown today with Zoom in the being fully developed and people used to working from home and having home office setups. So in some sense, a lockdown would be less costly today than it would have been than it was back in 2020 because we're used to it. But there's no good rhyme or reason. I know there's a COVID report written by the Chancellor of University of Western Sydney, and they said, look, we've lost trust with the Australian people because we made all these mistakes during COVID, and we did make mistakes. But I think if there was another virus, and you saw horrible news reports of some other country where their hospitals had been overrun and it was very grim, I think you'd find popular support for doing the same again would be there.
How do you know how far away you are from creating a vaccine, or is it just how far they're going with their research?
Yeah, it's a good question. The answer is with absolute certainty you don't. If you read about the process by which they developed these vaccines though, there was a lot of early signs that it would be a faster process than we had anticipated. Partly that was because the benefits were so large that a lot of the roadblocks were gotten out of the way. But for example, the viral sequencing of the COVID-19 vaccine, which is sort of one of the first building blocks, that was done in January of 2020. So like before it had exploded, they'd sequenced the virus. That was the sort of first building block, and they had, I think, manufactured like sort of what would eventually be the successful vaccine a couple months after that. So like there was in existence a test vaccine that ended up proving to be successful. It was just testing it, making sure it was safe, and then going through the rigors. Usually that would take 10 years in sort of a standard slow bore system. In an emergency, they sort of roll it down to less than 1. If it was an even worse virus with even more emergencies, even more urgency, I should say, would they do it quicker? Maybe. So, what about the end game of eradication? So that's basically what we did here in Australia, with varying degrees of success, depending on whether you're a Sydney-sider, a Melburnian, or you live in Perth. So basically the idea is you have a very severe lockdown until the disease is entirely eradicated, and then you have a glorious summer holiday where you can go out and live in a virus-free society. It's only really viable in isolated communities like Australia, New Zealand. You need to have a pretty strict system about who can come into your country under these circumstances, because obviously even one person slipping through quarantine means you start going straight back into lockdowns. I think, is it possible? A lot of people in other countries would say no, but here, clearly in Australia, we showed it was possible. Can you maintain it? I think the answer to that is probably no. We saw even the most competent regimes would eventually have outbreaks, and so it's a nice idea in theory, but ultimately very hard to achieve in practice.
But was our study not vaccination? Because my understanding that we would only open up once the population is adequately vaccinated.
It changed when we had vaccines. So remember, the vaccines were only publicly announced to be successful like the week after the 2020 US election. So throughout all of 2020, we were pursuing eradication with no knowledge of whether the vaccine would work or not. Like we had our scientists giving us optimistic assessments, but we didn't know that they were safe and passed trials until November or December of 2020. And that's when we knew there was a vaccine. We didn't order it or roll it out in a very quick manner, but at least that's when we knew it was an option. Until then, we were sort of looking at this eradication endgame, and it's an open question whether they thought that we would have to live in sort of a travel isolated world for long periods of time, but that was certainly a plausible outcome if we had got a vaccine and we wanted to live in a eradication, COVID-free world. Yep.
With regards to what's, I guess, viable and like realistically how professionals saw this playing out, were health professionals and like economists ever in disagreement about how to approach it? And like in that case, I guess who has the overruling?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. I mean, there was disagreement both within the economics field, and disagreement within the medical profession. So lots of people had lots of different opinions. I think if you looked at the Australian situation narrowly, I would say the chief health medical officers held a close to veto level approach to what the regulations would be, regardless of the economics or regardless maybe even of the politics. So I think they had a very strong whip hand as to what was permitted or not. Other countries had different outcomes. I don't think you get to eradication without the health officers being in charge. But if you think about countries that were navigating a more sort of mixed approach, you saw a lot of disagreement, for example, over the fact in the US that in some states bars would be open, but schools would be closed or online, which if you think about the relative welfare benefits of having schools open versus bars, it's certainly not the way I think a lot of people would have ordered their priority list, but that was a decision that was made, and economists would have disagreed with that ordering, I suspect, even if that's what the politicians ended up pursuing. Okay, the third potential endgame is herd immunity. So what if you say we're never going to get a vaccine, we can't eradicate it because we're not quite as competent as Australia and New Zealand, but and so what are we going to do instead? Well, you might want to approach a situation where you lead to herd immunity. So you think everyone's going to get infected eventually, but we still might have some role for lockdowns, particularly where we want to stop the health system from being overwhelmed. We don't want to minimize the overshooting past the herd immunity threshold. So you want to get to herd immunity and then not have too much virus in the community to minimize that overshooting that we saw in the SIR models. This can be tricky because we don't know exactly what the herd immunity threshold is, but this was the policy effectively implemented by much of the rest of the world. So for example, the UK, they weren't going to eradicate, they had too much of the virus, at least until the vaccines were developed. They went into lockdown whenever the NHS was heavily threatened with being overwhelmed. So that they did that for basically every winter period as a preventative measure to stop their ICUs from being overfull. And then finally, what's the end game if it's a chronic disease, which is where we are today? Basically, lockdowns are unlikely to be useful in this scenario. Why? Because preventing an infection today doesn't guarantee you won't get it in the future. We could go into a lockdown today, COVID and flu would all diminish, but then we just get it next season. So the benefits are fairly ephemeral. And so, in this sort of world where we ended up living, you might want to invest in better hygiene, better sick leave, more vaccinations, more contact tracing, but actually deploying lockdowns are unlikely to give benefits that are worth the substantial costs.
So these strategies are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, no.
And we pretty much touched on all of them.
We did, yeah. So it all depends. It depends on your expectation of the vaccine, whether it will be effective, timely, or not. It depends on whether you're an island nation or you're like a small country in Europe and you just can't control your borders. So you're right, there are a lot of factors that go into this. And as we see, we tried all of them at some period of time. Okay, so any questions about the effects of lockdowns before we move on, or the sort of cost-benefit analysis you want to think about? Let's move on then to a new kind of economic model. So in the first few days of the pandemic, a lot of people were thinking about, well, how should we think about this from a macroeconomic point of view? Most people will have, at least in the back of their head, their intuition is an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model of the economy. And this is, as it turns out, a very poor framework for thinking about the pandemic. Because it's not really an aggregate demand shock or an aggregate supply shock, it's some sort of mishmash of the two. And so it's very hard to think about the sort of shock that a pandemic might be in this model. But what model did turn out to be quite useful, or at least quite informative when designing lockdown, the economic response to lockdowns, was what we call a search and matching model. And a search and matching model, so if you think about it through a supply and demand model, you sort of get these big falls in both supply and demand. And so if you were to take them literally, you'd say the result is lower output, with inflation being somewhat ambiguous. But in practice, this was a sort of a messy interpretation of COVID-19. The search and matching model is a pre-existing model, so we didn't invent it for the pandemic, but it's one that became much more useful during the pandemic. Because instead of thinking, as we do with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, that jobs equal output, and that there are relatively simple dynamics in an economy whereby, in an aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, there is no dynamics. You can shift the lines about at any period of time, and there's no relationship between what happened in the past period and what happens in future periods. If an aggregate demand shock shifts the line up, then you can shift it down in the next period and return to equilibrium. So there are no dynamics in an aggregate demand, aggregate supply world. And in practice, the labour market is a lot more complex than this simple framework would suggest. And so we need a model that incorporates that complexity, and that's what the search and matching model does. All right, so what is the search and matching model? So the intuition behind the search and matching model is that instead of just having a lump of labour that goes off and feeds into some Cobb-Douglas production function and produces some output that's all identical, we actually have a wide spread of different types of workers and different types of jobs. And you can't just show up and have any worker do any job. Instead, you need to form matches. And those matches can be hard to form because you want the right set of skills with the right employer. So this process of matching workers and firms is really important. You won't get a useful job and a useful employer, a firm match without undergoing this matching process, but it can be a time-consuming process. And so you can think about that, you're swiping, looking for different options to match with, and that process, I'm sure you guys have all engaged in different versions of this search and matching process, can be timely, costly, but when you find the right match, as I did when I found my dog here, you have a beautiful relationship that lasts a long period of time. So how do we model the labour market with this search and matching framework? Well, we have firms and workers. You can think of these as these like green and blue circles. And the vast majority of firms and workers will have formed a match. So you can draw that match in that dashed box here. And they represent firms who have employed a worker, they pay them a wage, the worker works for them and produces some output, and everybody is happy because they're earning a wage and making some profit. But you've got some firms who have a vacancy, so firms that are out there who have posted a vacancy and are looking for people, they're interviewing people, trying to find the right match. And you have some unemployed workers who are out there looking for work. And that process of matching up these workers and firms takes time, it takes effort, and can be quite costly. But if you do manage to find a match between a worker and a firm, it's going to persist across time. So if you're employed today, with a very high probability, you'll keep that job and you'll be employed tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. But with some small percentage chance, some of these matches will break up. So you might, the firm might go bankrupt, the worker might decide to quit or get fired for some reason. And so there's going to be two flows between these two groups. You're going to have unemployed workers and firms who occasionally match up to form new employment arrangements. And every so often you're going to have employee matches with their firms break apart and become unemployed again. Yep.
There's a couple of things that could see, like with the restructuring, and therefore there'd be someone that's lost a job and wouldn't have a vacancy.
Yeah, so in this case, what we kind of simplify the idea of firms to be, we assume all firms are like one worker, small businesses. So the idea of having like a firm with 100 employees, that's a complexity that we ignore. We just think of firms as being sort of a one worker agency. They pair up with one worker, they produce some output, and then they match and disappear. So in practice, yes, whenever they break apart, they might both be looking for a vacancy, and they both might be looking for a firm at the same time. And we sort of don't really take into account the fact that they would obviously not want to hire each other again, but yeah, we assume that there are thousands upon thousands of firms, thousands upon thousands of workers. So if for whatever reason you do end up breaking up, it's sort of not, you just ditch that one CV or resume and don't hire the same person again. Okay, so you have matches persisting over time. If you're employed yesterday, you'll most likely be employed today, but with some probability, matches will break up and you'll have an employed, you'll have that worker become unemployed and that firm will now have an empty vacancy. And then they search around looking for a new partner. Usually this takes a long period of time. And when they do find a new match, they agree to a new wage and they earn some profit from the form of employment. And so what does this mean? Well, in this world, there's always going to be a stock of unemployed workers. And there's always going to be firms that are looking for vacancies. So you might think, well, why do we have both unemployed workers and firms with vacancies existing at the same time? Surely you could just pair them all up and send them on their merry way. The reason why you're going to have both unemployed workers and firms with vacancies at the same time is because you can't just easily match workers with firms. You need to find the right match between them. And so you're going to have flows between those two states. Workers are going to be unemployed, finding jobs, moving into employment, then losing their jobs and flowing back into unemployment over time. And you've got firms that have workers and so form a profitable match, then breaking up with their worker, becoming a firm with a vacancy, searching for a worker to hire, and then going back into a employment relationship. And so you're going to have these two types of stocks and flows between them. And policies can affect those flows. They can change the stock of unemployed workers, but you can never eliminate them. So when we think about search and matching models, a really common policy question is, well, how can we reduce the number of unemployed workers in the context of this model? And there are a bunch of policies you could potentially implement, and that will reduce the number of unemployed workers, but it will never get it to 0%. So how do we think about these flows between employment and unemployment and having a vacancy versus having an employment relationship? Well, these flows are going to be based upon the probability that you find the right worker and the probability that a firm finds a match. And the probability that a worker finds a match is going to be proportional to the number of vacancies divided by the number of the unemployed workers. And that ratio is flipped for the probability of a firm finding a match. You can think about the intuition for this if we think about the example of a search and matching model in the context of the dating market. Assuming, a fairly heteronormative world, if you've got both men and women looking to find matches in a search and matching model, the probability that a man finds a match will be higher if there are lots of women and not many men available, and the exact opposite will be the case for a woman trying to find a match. They'll have a much higher probability of finding a match if there are lots of men searching on the apps rather than women. So it's, the probabilities that you'll find a match depend on how many unemployed workers are out there and how many firms with a vacancy that are out there. In the context of the labour market, we can think of this as being how much tightness there is in the labour market. If you're in the middle of a recession where there are lots of unemployed workers and not many firms looking for a vacancy because they think business conditions are relatively tough, then it's going to be very easy for a firm to find a match, but really hard for a worker to find a job. And vice versa, if you think about an economic boom time when there are not many unemployed workers, but there are lots of firms looking to hire. So, as I mentioned, this search and matching model pre-exists COVID, but it was seen as quite an influential model during COVID-19 because it helped describe what was going on during lockdowns. So lockdowns are a period of many months, maybe even a year, in which all economic activity stops. Now, if that's all you did, you implemented a lockdown, you didn't have any more economic support, this would effectively break all the matches in the economy, right? So every job that is now illegal due to the lockdowns would go out of business, they'd have to fire all their employees, the businesses would be affected by their landlords, customers would have to find new suppliers. If you think about this as a series of matches in the economy, you would break them all overnight. And so what would happen when you exited that period of lockdown? Well, you'd have a very large pool of unemployed workers and maybe a big large pool of firms looking to find new matches, but they would have to go through that costly process of trying to fill their vacancies with new workers. You know, they might say, call up their old employee and say, come back and work for me, but they may have found another job already. So then you're stuck advertising on Seek to find new workers. That means you have to go through rounds of interviews. All this takes time and all of this is very costly. So if we were living in an aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, we would just say you can bounce back to equilibrium by changing the interest rate, changing fiscal policy. But in a search and matching model, they would say, well, it will actually take years, or at least many, many months to find new matches for every worker and landlord. If, again, go back to the dating analogy, if we implemented a compulsory divorce for every couple in Australia, and then said, okay, everyone's divorced and broken up with their partner, we're now going to legalise marriage again, and you can go out and find someone else to marry with, it would not be straight back to 60% marriage rates overnight. It would take many, many grueling years for new matches to form with other partners in the economy. So we don't want to break up these matches if we can help it. Yes, we want to stop people infecting other people. That's the whole point of a lockdown. But we want to preserve matches as much as possible. And so the solution that economists devised was to effectively put the economy into suspended animation. We want to stop people leaving their house, effectively. We want to preserve these matches as much as possible. And in some sense, this is a normal annual part of the economy. So what does this graph here show? It shows the quarterly change in GDP. Now, it looks very volatile, and that's because unlike almost every single GDP graph you'll ever see, this is the non-seasonally adjusted change in quarterly GDP. And so what does it show? Well, I mean, if you look at this regular spike at the bottom, this is Q1 Australian GDP growth, and it is deeply, deeply negative. Every January, February, March, the economy of Australia contracts by 6%. Now, if this was normal GDP statistics, we would say a quarterly fall of 6% is like worse than the global financial crisis 10 times over. But we don't see this annual purge of economic activity as a bad thing. Why? Because it's, as I said, summer holidays. The reason why GDP contracts by 6% is that most people take several weeks off over the course of January and maybe even February. They all sit on the beach, they don't do any work.